Hello and welcome to Let's Pod This. My name is Andy Moore. Welcome to the program. We are on the Friday side of a 3-day weekend, holiday weekend. I know some of you had 4 or 5-day weekends. I, for one, am jealous of that. But I hope that you have, whatever time you have, are using it to, rest, recuperate, rejuvenate yourself, find a body of cold water to sit in, preferably, right? A kiddie pool, which is what I have in the backyard, or a glass of water, whatever. Just celebrate our nation's independence by recognizing the freedoms we have, and to the extent your brain can, plot out how you can help us ensure that those freedoms continue to exist for future generations. Now I'm just giving away the plan of the episode here. But joining me today is my co-host Bailey Perkins Wright. Hello, Bailey.
Hello, Andy.
Welcome back. You've been out of town the last couple of weeks. It's good to see you.
I have. I'm glad to be back on the pod.
Scott, it's his turn to be out of town today, so it's just me and Bailey. Scott will have to listen on his own and just, with angst, missing out on some of this stuff. So this week, we're going to talk about the primary election here in Oklahoma. Who won, who didn't, who we don't yet know, who's going to a runoff, and how that shapes or potentially shapes the November election. We'll also talk about some progress made at the federal level for food security that Bailey's going to share with us. That's important to know. There's been some shakeups in state agency leadership, as always. The Senate has announced some interim studies. We'll just get into it. It's another week in Oklahoma politics and government. And
It is.
we'll start with just a brief mention. Earlier this week, we published I dare call it a mini episode, but a statement about the Supreme Court's decision on the two cases that essentially overturned Roe versus Wade.
Well, frankly, on a lot of things.
Yeah, that's right. And in a few weeks, we don't have the date just yet, but in a few weeks, we hope to have an episode with a couple of very intelligent and insightful attorneys to help us discuss all of the Supreme Court decisions not all of them, the several of them that were
The significant ones,
very significant this year.
From
That
EPA regulation to Andy and I were just talking about impacts to reading Miranda rights, abortion law, all those kind of things. There's just so many things that this court has been very, very active on in such a short time.
That's right. Yeah. I think the term activist judges is just laud, like it's used by whichever side is against how they were activating, right? And so a lot of these things were decided on a 6-3 vote line, right? Which is essentially a partisan, along partisan lines with the court, which is a departure from how it's been for the last several years, maybe several decades. Usually you'd have really contentious votes on party lines, but most else was a little bit closer.
But Andy, I do want to mention some good news related to the courts that have happened. As of yesterday, Ketanji Brown Jackson was confirmed as a Supreme Court Justice of the United States. She is the first Black woman to ever serve on the Supreme Court in our country's history. So, we celebrate July 4th as Independence Day and typically recognize that as the time where what we know as America formed. And since then, we had never had a Black woman on the court. So as of yesterday, I believe, for sure this week, she was sworn in and confirmed. Justice Breyer, I think he hit his peak time of what he could tolerate and said, I think I'm ready to go. And I think Ketanji's ready. And so the swearing in happened. And so that, and as a silver lining to everything that's going on, that did happen. So
yeah, it is interesting. I've seen several comments of don't think we didn't notice all of these decisions that they crammed through at the end of Breyer's term before the new justice was sworn in. So it will be interesting to see how this molds and shapes the court moving forward. I believe she's only like the fifth or sixth woman, period, to be on the court. Um,
Yes.
it's the numbers, as far as like reflecting what America looks like, are staggering when it comes to the court, and honestly, most other government entities. Congress is not much different as well, proportionally speaking, and certainly the presidency, which has been, a bunch of white men and one black man.
Right. Absolutely. So, and people talk about all the time, as we, prepare to transition into our conversation about elections. Oh, the national election, my vote doesn't matter, but it really does, because the votes that we take have long-term impacts. And one of the significant elements that we saw out of the 2016 election was, the passing of RGB. We saw, the fact that the president had the ability to appoint two, I believe three. Did he appoint two or three?
You got three. Yeah.
He got three Supreme Court seats to appoint. And having that opportunity to fill those positions with people who have the viewpoint that abortion is a states' right issue, that, certain EPA regulations, should be overturned, and all these other things are a direct result to what happened in 2016 and prior elections. So it's just another reminder that everything is interconnected and our collective voices matter, and the decisions we make, decisions or non-decisions that we make. So not showing up to vote was a decision that also leads to significant changes into, like, our Supreme Court, for instance, that's going to be there probably for a long time.
Decades, right?
It could
Yeah.
be in the next 10 years, it could be generationally, because those are lifetime appointments, right? And so we have to remember that those decisions matter, whether it's at our local level, whether it's at the federal level, right? We have to show up to ensure that our voices and our perspectives are heard.
Yeah. And even though the the presidency is not on the ballot this year in 2022, even in Oklahoma, both of our U.S. senators are on the ballot.
Yes.
And, even for Supreme Court justices, the president appoints them, but the Senate has to confirm them. And this is a direct way that we can have a say in who our senators are. And with the Senate being such a tight margin, right? Like a
Yes.
one vote majority.
Who we send there can make the difference of what type of legislation makes it through the process, and what things get blocked, or, what things are considered, what the priority becomes, right?
Yeah.
That all matters.
One of my pet peeves, Bailey, is when legislative bodies like the Senate or Congress or the state legislature don't vote on bills because they don't want, the majority doesn't want their members to have to take a hard vote. Like, they don't want to have to actually say if they support or don't support something. They don't want a record of it. And that seems, I don't know. I get that it is politically strategic. It also seems cowardly, right? And I understand that they would rather be strategic than courageous, but it really gets under my skin. I just want people to, what? You're there to take a vote. That's your job, is to vote on these things. We should vote.
I mean, and the polling typically shows that, like, the people want a decision, right?
Right.
They want to know where you stand, whether, they agree with you or not. They do want to know where you stand on something. And so that matters. So it is interesting how sometimes in these political spaces, politicians tie themselves in a box, right? With the perception of, how is that going to affect me in polling or whatever? When the reality is, a lot of people feel frustrated by the perception of inaction, right? That there aren't positions taken, there aren't, hard votes that are taken, and so, all those things matter. And I mean, to the point of, our conversation here, of, as a voter, right, as a person who lives in the state of Oklahoma, as a resident, you have an obligation to ask those questions, right? Ask those folks who want your vote, how do they feel about the things that you care about? And don't let them give you a non-answer, because a non-answer is an answer in itself. And you want people who are going to be able to stand for the things that you want and need for your community. So we have to show up. I know, Andy, as we transition to our conversation on what happened in our election cycle, because we just had an election this week on Tuesday, turnout was abysmal
Yep.
per usual.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, the numbers were exactly what we expected them to be, which is to say bad, right? I mean, so roughly, I don't know, 450,000 or 500,000 people turned out. And
We have more than
that,
4 million people who live in Oklahoma.
right, yeah. So, and to paint with a broad brush, or to use round numbers, I guess, in Oklahoma, there are roughly 3 million eligible voters, right? People of voting age. And then there are only 2 million who are actually registered. And usually in like a general election, only 1 million show up. But here in this primary, only 500,000, right? So that's essentially 1/6, right? Like of the total number that are eligible, and 1/4 of those that are even registered. The turnout was not the same for both parties. If you look in the numbers, Republicans turned out at about 30% turnout, and then Democrats and independents together, because independents are allowed to vote in the Democratic primary. The Democratic Party in Oklahoma allows independents to vote in their primaries. And so those numbers are all kind of blurred together. Anyway, only about 15% of them. And that is just very low. Now, there's a few reasons for this, aside from people's, I don't know, general apathy towards voting and their feelings about it. I think what we've also seen is that there were more races on the Republican side than the Democratic side on the ballot, right? And many of them were more contentious. For example, the race for to replace Jim Inhofe's Senate seat, right? There was only one Democrat in that race, Kendra Horn. She didn't have a primary. It's just her. So it's not like that race was driving Democrats to turn out. On the other side, though, Republicans, they had like 14 candidates, right? So there was a lot of interest there. And what we typically see is that those, we'll say, statewide races, things like governor, Senate, even congressional races, the higher up on the ballot, those top of the ticket, as they say, those races tend to drive more turnout. And you can look and see how many people voted in each race, and it decreases the further down the page you go. So those last things, like here in Oklahoma County, we had a bond question about a new jail that was, those kind of questions are always the last thing. And it was pretty low. It was like almost 100,000 people lower voted for that than the top of the ticket on the Democratic and independent side. So you see that roll off there.
And another part of that is, when it comes to visibility of elections, the higher up you are on the ballot, the more money is spent on that, right? For our US Senate races, for instance, there's millions of dollars poured into those elections, and people can't turn the channel without seeing a commercial, hearing a radio ad. You're watching Netflix and you see, a commercial for, one of the candidates who are vying. So especially in those federal races or those statewide races, there is more visibility. So that typically leads to more people showing up. And sometimes those, as Andy said, those down ballot races, or even like those local ballot measures, they don't have typically the same amount of funding or even time, for that matter, of promoting those candidates or those issues. So
yeah. I mean, I saw the other day that already, no, excuse me, in the month of June for this primary, there were $10 million spent on independent expenditures, right? So not by the candidates' campaigns, but by third-party organizations in support or in opposition to candidates. $10 million this month alone. To put that in comparison, when Governor Stitt ran for governor the first time, right, 4 years ago, he put in about $10 million of his money, which was the bulk of the money he raised for his campaign. So just in 1 month, right, that's a big chunk of money. And there was a lot of outside money flowing in to be in support and in opposition to candidates here. And sometimes it was a little bit surprising. And we don't quite have time to get into who gave what money where, but maybe Bailey, let's run through and discuss a couple of these races just because they will shape what happens in November, right? So
Yeah. Well, and I
in
have a
general,
few general stats that, thanks to a firm that I work with, they shared a few just shorthand facts that there were 11 candidates who will move on to face a runoff on August 23rd. And I want to say that's like state level and in federal, so not
yeah.
necessarily like any like judicial candidates or anything like
Oh,
that.
right. But no, people like the labor commissioner, like Leslie Osborne's the incumbent. She has a runoff.
Exactly.
Yeah, those kinds of races.
Yeah, and even with congressional district 2, for instance, I'd love to dig into that a little bit. I
Yeah.
mean, you had people who got like 15 and 13% of the vote who are moving on to the runoff, right? But that's what happens when the race is saturated. So there were 28 uncontested seats. So those are people who won their primaries and will not require a general election, meaning that there wasn't somebody in the opposing party running. So whoever won in that primary is the candidate, right? That's going to be the person who's going to be in that role. And then there were 21 candidates who won their primary and will move to the November 8th general election ballot. So we can dig into, who some of
Yeah.
those folks are.
Yeah. Interesting. So, just off the top, we know Governor Stitt won his primary contest. So he will be
69% of the vote.
yeah. So, probably not as high as people thought, but he will advance on to the general election. So he's the Republican nominee. On the Democratic side, Joy Hoffmeister won. So it'll be Stitt versus Hoffmeister versus.
And Hoffmeister got about a little over 60% of the vote as well.
Mhm.
So they both were
Yeah.
in the 60s.
And so they'll face Natalie Bruno, who's a libertarian
Mhm.
candidate. And then there's at least one independent. Irvin Yin is
Yes.
independent and running.
Yes.
So there will
So there will
likely
be
be
4 people on your ballot for governor in November.
yeah. State Auditor Cindy Byrd won her nomination. And then let's talk about this for a minute. This was perhaps the most discussed race of the night. AG, Attorney General John
Yes.
O'Connor,
So
lost.
this is an example of like just because you're an incumbent doesn't mean that it's guaranteed. And although that Attorney General John O'Connor is not a traditional incumbent, meaning that he was appointed to fill a vacancy by the governor until the next election happens, it doesn't mean that you're guaranteed, right? There's been a lot of concern and criticism of him since he was nominated to be our AG, including, I mean, Andy, we talked about on previous podcasts of, the American Bar Association coming out, raising concerns about his legitimacy as the best person for AG. And so it is a big deal that Gittner Drummond was able to squeak by like, and this is again, when we talk about why every vote counts, he won by just a little over 6,000 votes, right?
Mhm.
So he,
Very
and in a
narrow.
large race that has, 400,000 people participating in it, 6,000 is just like a few people more showed up to vote for Drummond than O'Connor, right?
Yeah.
So it's so important that we show up and vote in all the races.
What I think is interesting too. Well, one, that Drummond barely lost in 2018. So when he ran previously, he
Against Mike
lost by
Hunter.
only
Mhm.
271 votes. So he joked that for a guy who lost by 271 votes, 6,000 votes is a veritable landslide for him this time. But his statements, Bailey, I don't know if did you see this at his victory party, watch party in Tulsa?
No.
He said, so Gittner Drummond said, quote, "I was running against the governor and his appointee. I think that's what tonight's vote illustrates, is that a majority of people want transparency and accountability. They want honesty and integrity. People are sick of scandal and corruption. And I was just like, well,
Wow.
that's a strong statement. For one, for a winner, usually there's some graciousness often, but then like kind of a thanks volunteers and kumbaya, we're going to do this. But he was just like, bam, I ran because I ran against the governor and his appointee. And I think it's, from what I've heard, it's a pretty well known deal that Drummond is not a fan of Governor Stitt. And now, I mean, he's the presumed attorney general. I think he's got maybe a libertarian opponent. Anyway, he's got to go through
Yes.
November, but it's expected that he'll win. And for him to come out so strongly against the governor already sets up a very different dynamic than we've
Yes.
had for the last however many months that John O'Connor has been there.
Because John
Where,
O'Connor's been basically like a ally or extension of the governor's office as an
yes,
appointee. And now we'll have potentially a contentious relationship between now the AG's office and the governor's office. And then you have, the state auditor who I won't say has been, any type of adversarial to the governor's office, anybody. She's just doing her job of investigating the things and doing the audits, right? I do wonder, should Governor Stitt win in November, what that dynamic is going to look like over the next 4 years.
yeah, I do too. And I'll be honest, this is the piece of Oklahoma politics that I enjoy. I know we make jokes about the fact that we elect so many different positions, right? But I like when you see candidates that recognize that they are accountable not to a higher office, but to the people, right? Like Gittner Drummond understands that hopefully, he understands that he is accountable to the voters. Cindy Byrd is accountable to the voters. Governor Stitt is accountable to the voters.
And because they're independently elected, they can hold each other accountable, right?
Right.
I think
Right.
that is the beauty of how Oklahoma has designed its election system of each of the statewide offices.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah, a lot of it's like a checks and balance even in the executive branch there. So, and I think that's a good thing. That's me. Another race that received a lot of attention that is also going to a runoff is the Republican race for superintendent of public instruction. This seat is currently held by Joy Hoffmeister, who is terming out. She's term limited, so she's running for governor. And Governor Stitt's education secretary, Ryan Walters, is probably the big name in the race. But because he did not get 50% or 51%, he goes to a runoff against April Grace.
And April Grace is a superintendent of Shawnee Public Schools,
Yeah,
who is known as a level-headed leader. She has a lot of respect from her colleagues who are state superintendents and other educators. And so, what I think will be most interesting is to see, because John Cox received about 25% of the vote, and he holds a pretty strong hold for many educators. So, who will John Cox voters go to? And I have a hunch that they will throw their support behind April Grace. No doubt that this is going to be another tight race, right? There's not going to be probably a landslide in what happens in November. But it'll be a numbers game of, whether educators and teachers who have had, frustration or concern with Ryan Walters and the different comments that he's made and the stances that he's taken and the letters that he's written, to different school districts. Are they going to mobilize and support essentially one of their own, right?
yeah, yeah.
So we'll see. I'm interested to see what happens in that race as well.
I am too. It's going to be a close race. I think you're right. Senator Langford handily won his reelection bid for the Republican nomination, and this is worth noting because he really beat the pants off of Jackson Lahmeyer, who was a far right challenger, and about the same margin as Governor Stitt beat his far right challenger Mark Sherwood, and so I think we've seen a bit of a rejection of this I don't know if it's a rejection of this far right rhetoric or if it's just incumbent, privilege of taking
I
that
don't
on.
think so, Andy. I think what I would say it's the first, right?
Mhm.
It's there are a lot of loud voices, but they are not as widespread as we would believe, right? It's kind of like social media. You read the 15 to 20 people in the comment section, but they don't represent all 4 million Oklahomans, right?
Right.
And I think there really is this um, let's get our house in order kind of feeling among Republicans in Oklahoma, because even the former state party chair, John Bennett,
Yeah.
fared terribly in the congressional district 2 race, right? I mean, he wasn't even in the top 5.
No. Yeah.
And so I think there really is this rejection of the far right that is happening, especially, I mean, typically incumbents, they'll campaign, but they're not typically worried about whether or not they'll be reelected. But I think Senator Langford took this race seriously, right? And he
Yeah.
was using further right rhetoric than he had in the past in this race because of how much what it appeared to be momentum and traction that Laymeyer was getting.
Hmm.
And when it came down to it of who showed up to the polls, it did not translate as, what the appearance was. And so I think that is a good sign that more Oklahomans want to see rationality
Yeah. Right.
more so than extremism.
Yeah. We I would be remiss if I didn't acknowledge that there was a second challenger, a third candidate in that race against Langford. So Langford, Laymeyer, and a woman named Joan Farr, Farr, who is running for U.S. Senate in Oklahoma and in Kansas this year. So she lost this race. She somehow received 20,000 votes here, but she has another chance in about a month. And the first week in August is the Kansas primary.
I don't think I've ever heard of that.
No,
I don't think I've
according to
ever heard of
her,
that.
she's the first woman to ever done that. There have been some congressional candidates, like House candidates, that did it, but she says she's the first person who's done it for the Senate. There's nothing in the law that prevents a person from running in more than one state. You can only serve in one. You have to live in the state where you serve. And so her response was like, well, if I win one of these, I'll just live in that state. And I don't anticipate she's going to win. I did spend a long time on her website the other day, and it is interesting to say the least. It was very interesting. Just absolutely
I
wild.
guess you need to post in the show notes.
Yeah, yeah. I don't want to give her a lot of credit, but there were her thoughts on how 5G caused COVID, and now COVID was created so that to justify absentee voting, and that was done to keep Trump out of office. But that was the only reference to Trump on the whole website. But
Okay.
there was a lot of stuff about lawsuits and how she doesn't think don't need attorneys, but somehow she, as not a lawyer, has taken 12 cases to the Supreme Court, but the court refused to hear them. It was a lot. It was,
That
like I
that
said,
is a lot, and thankful that it's scary that 20,000 people supported that, but also in the grand scheme of things, 20,000 isn't a lot in that
no.
race. So
And it,
thankfully,
yeah, and they may have been folks who just like knew Langford, knew Laymeyer, and said, "I don't like these guys,"
and just
but
yeah,
put the other person. Yeah.
or I happened to drive by and I saw a far sign and I
Hmm.
just picked that.
Yeah.
In fact, I was sitting in a church and I cringed when I heard the statement, but this pastor said, he was saying everybody needs to go vote. And in my head, I'm like, yeah, yeah. And then the minister goes, sometimes I just get to the ballot box and I just flip a coin, but I'm still going to show up to vote. And I was like, oh, you're
Right.
almost there.
Yeah.
But there really are some people who may see a race and they're like, I don't know, so I'm just going to, and that could be some of those 20,000 votes. So
Yeah.
thanks, Andy, for helping to give some benefit of the doubt that maybe if they would have known that those are maybe some of her belief systems, they may have made a different choice or
Oof,
maybe left
man.
it blank or whatever.
Yeah.
But
Um, for the other U.S. Senate race, this is the race to replace Jim Inhofe.
I think what we expected to happen happened in that race.
Yeah, I think as expected, Markwayne Mullin came out ahead, but again, didn't get more than 50%. So he too has a runoff.
But I will say, to achieve, I believe it was like, what, 45% of the vote in that race?
43, yeah.
43. That's significant in a race that has several people. So if that was just like a 3-person or 3, maybe 4-person race, then that would be understandable of not, I mean, I would expect to get closer to that 50% plus 1, but what there were like at least 6 or 7. So Scott Pruitt didn't perform as well as I thought he was going to perform. Nathan Dahm, also again, to the conversation about that extremism, he did not get a significant number of votes. I don't know if he cracked even above 10%.
Yeah, he got 12%. He was third.
So third. Okay, so 12%. So yeah, like I think it's him getting 43% of the vote, Markwayne Mullin, for this race that had several people, is telling that there's momentum building for him in that runoff.
Yeah, so it'll be interesting. So the runoff will be between Markwayne Mullin and T.W. Shannon.
Because TW only got what, like 15% of the vote?
17, yeah.
Like 15, 17, yeah. Yeah, it was less than a fifth of the vote. So, and that's what got him to the runoff. So I think it's really significant and telling of the strength of Markwayne Mullin's candidacy and likelihood of being the Republican candidate.
Yeah. No, that's a big deal. I mean, there were 13 candidates in the race, and so to get almost half out of 13 candidates is a huge deal. I think that bodes well for him. I'm really curious how T.W. Shannon feels about that. That would be humbling, I think, to say the least.
Well, no, it might be deja vu, because remember when he ran against Langford for U.S. Senate, Langford got 70% of the vote and he got 30%, right? And so this could be telling that the tides could, the outcome could be very similar to what he faced in, was that 2018?
Could be.
Or was that 2016?
Yeah, 14, maybe.
14, okay. Ooh, yeah. So long ago.
It may be this
way back when.
It may be the sign to Mr. Shannon that politics is, maybe his political career is over, right? Like it's losing once is hard enough, but losing twice on this race is difficult. Now there's other options, but it is significant.
Well, and I think even our conversation about extremism, right? I think Oklahomans are showing that they want and I won't even say Oklahomans, I will say in the makeup of who is advancing in these larger races, in the conservative races, they're wanting someone who's not tying to extremism, right? We're seeing, especially with like the Roe v. Wade situation, I think there was a lot of people who didn't think that was going to happen as soon as it did. You know what I mean? And so I think people see the writings of the wall of how dangerous the rhetoric can be, how far we can move to where our belief system of people having rights can be suppressed, even on the belief systems that people on the right have. You know what I mean? And so, yeah, I don't think that like Oklahomans want extremism.
I hope you're right. I mean, we'll find out in November, but
That's true. True.
I want to believe that's true. The problem is, I think the problem is that most Oklahomans do not want extremism. They want reasonable, moderate, center right politics, right? Fiscally conservative, maybe socially liberal-ish. The problem is that most folks don't vote, right?
That's a great point.
If turnout was higher, right? If we had 70% turnout, 80%, I think we would have a very dramatically different political landscape in Oklahoma. And that's honestly what I think a lot of us are working towards, right?
That is true, but also even the infrastructure piece that would have to change as well to ensure that 70 to 80% turnout meant something, right? So if we still have straight ticket voting, if we still have, some of, in this closed primary system, those things are barriers to ensuring that people's vote feels meaningful to them, that they can see that their vote has value. So I think you raise a great point about what elections could look like if we were to boost turnout, but also what could happen if some of those structural barriers were alleviated. Would we see a different Oklahoma? Like, will we see different candidates, or will we hear different rhetoric on the TV? Right? Like that is interesting.
That's interesting. So on the congressional races for CD 3, 4, and 5, the incumbents won easily. That's Frank Lucas, Tom Cole, and Stephanie Bice.
As expected.
Yeah, that was expected. CD 1, Kevin Hearn's seat, he didn't have a challenger, so that wasn't on the ballot for the primary for Republicans. And then CD 2 was the seat currently held by Mark Wayne Mullen. That's obviously he's vacating. And as you mentioned earlier, a wide open field of roughly 14 candidates. I will correct you earlier. John Bennett did better than you think. He got 11%, which puts him in like fourth place, I think.
Okay.
So,
well, but then again, there's a lot of people who had no name ID that were running in that race. Maybe they had name ID in their community, but in the larger conversation of those who have been engaged in the political space, you would think he would fare differently and get a little bit more of the vote. But
yeah, I mean, you would think. And honestly, the two guys who finished first and second, Avery Fricks,
former lawmakers or current lawmakers, I'd say, with Avery Fricks, a current lawmaker, Burkina, former. So
yeah, but I mean, I recognize Fricks's name. I didn't know. Is it Burkine?
Burkine. Yep, he's a former lawmaker.
Yeah. Okay. Well, and Marty Quinn, he's a lawmaker. Dustin Roberts. There's a lot of folks that ran in this. So anyway, a runoff for that. So nobody got over 15% in this race. It was a very kind of flat field. So like Avery Fricks got 14.7. Burkine got 13.7. Then you've got a 13%, 11, almost 11.
It was just too saturated, right? If you have a number of people who have similar belief systems, they can cancel each other out, right?
Yeah. A lot of splitting going on there. So that's interesting.
Well, and I want to make sure we don't forget state treasurer, because that was another race.
If you want to bring that up,
yeah. So, have we talked about this yet on the pod of one of the candidates?
About David Hooten, I think we did, but I don't remember. It may have been a week that we skipped, but
one of the candidates for state treasurer has been in a little bit of heat because he serves as the county clerk for Oklahoma County. And he had some controversy of saying inappropriate things to his female staff. And then some other controversies related to hiring campaign people and a number of other things that came out to where he resigned as county clerk. So he came in fourth in that race, I believe, for state treasurer. And so we have current state representative Todd Russ, who received 49% of that vote, and the current Oklahoma Tax Commission chairman, Clark Jolly, advancing to be our next state treasurer. So, and the winner of that will face a libertarian candidate as well as a Democratic candidate as well. So,
what I would love to have is like a whole wall that's like a March Madness style bracket situation, where you can maybe it's more than one wall, but you have all of the legislative races and the statewide races and the congressional races with the candidates on, all the candidates from various sides, kind of arrows going in, so I can write in the winners. This is like how I used to do March Madness in college. We would just print off brackets and tape them to the wall at my friend's house so we could highlight winners and tally up our scores.
I'm going to say it on the pod, so hopefully it can be true. If things continue to recover and, we get in a place where people feel comfortable gathering again, maybe we have a live podcast on election night in the next election, where we have that big marquee set up and we're writing things out, and I think that'd be fun.
Well, and Bailey, I'll say it. I don't know if I've referenced it on here or not, but we are already scheduled. It is on the books. I've put down a deposit at the Tower Theater for us to have the election night show like we did in 2018. So I'm hoping that, the Tower has pretty reasonable, guidelines for COVID precautions. We'll obviously be monitoring things. It'll be November. Hopefully by then, most of us will be eligible for another booster, my fourth shot, right? My daughter got her first booster this week because
Oh,
she's
yes, because
two,
that's
so that's
another
exciting.
important thing to lift that
Yeah.
FDA has approved. Those who are 6 months old and older
Mhm.
can now receive the COVID vaccine.
Yeah.
So
So
nearly all of our population can get vaccinated.
wouldn't that be nice? Although, I mean, it's so tough because vaccination is still important. It definitely helps prevent severe disease. In some cases, depending on how long it's been, it may not provide as much protection against having it. I mean, I'm sure, like you, I've had a ton of friends that have had it in the last few weeks. Some of them have had it quite seriously, even folks my age. I have a colleague in another state that her and her husband and their son had it, and they're all vaccinated and had a pretty difficult course. And she said we were really glad that we were vaccinated because if it was this bad with the vaccine, it could have been way worse, and you don't always know. So
Absolutely. I mean, because people forget that the vaccine is not supposed to be a cure. It's supposed to keep you from dying and suffering.
that's right, which is a big deal. So, and who
Yes.
knows?
Yes,
Maybe by
indeed.
then we'll have a cure, or maybe it'll go
Yes.
away. Anyway, listeners, mark your calendar on Tuesday, November 8th. Put election day, go vote. And then at mark at 6 p.m., the election night show at the Tower Theater in Oklahoma City. I've already started ordering supplies for this event, like decor, outfits. It's gonna be great. It was a lot of fun. We had about 700 people that came in 2018. And if you are unfamiliar, listeners, it's like the Tonight Show, right? It's like a late night talk show, but it's with Oklahoma people, and it's about the elections. We'll have live election results, and we'll have guests. We'll have live music, food, drinks. All that stuff. Very fun. In fact, in 2018, Joy Hoffmeister
She
came
did.
early and gave our top 10 list as a nod to David Letterman, who's my favorite late night talk show host. So I assume she'll be busy this year, but
Yeah.
um, we can always dream. All right. Well, do you want to talk about some of the state legislative races real quick, and then we'll hit
Absolutely.
the food security news?
Sure. Yes. So there were 17 incumbents this year who were able to retain their seats. There was an active C4 effort, particularly from the school choice crowd, who was challenging some incumbents. Like, for example, Representative Rhonda Baker is regarded as a person who's strong on public education as a former teacher. And there was an effort this session to move voucher legislation that would take monies that are public dollars and fund private schools, where as the advocates for that would say, to have the dollars follow the student, right? And we saw pushback of that, especially on the House side. And so with that came essentially retaliation. And so she won her seat just barely over the 50% mark, right? So almost 51%. But a lot of the tight races of incumbents that were unusual were tied often to that school choice effort to try to unseat certain candidates. There were candidates who were targeted. I'll say that. We had two incumbents that did lose their seats. Representative Wendy Stearman and Representative Logan Phillips. Now, I will say on Representative Logan Phillips, it will definitely be a loss on the energy he brought and the expertise on modernizing Oklahoma on broadband and issues related to expanding technology access across the state, right? And there are places in Oklahoma that do not have internet in 2022. It's crazy. Oh, and then also, yes, Senator Merrick lost his race as well. So there were three incumbents. I misspoke on that. And so,
And then several more that have to go to runoff still, like Darcy
yes.
Yeck, he's got a runoff.
Yes.
There's a few others that it's not. I mean, on the whole, it is still better to be an incumbent because we draw districts to favor incumbents, and we know that in Oklahoma, incumbents win at a rate of like 91%.
Yes.
But some of these are notable that they lost because they were attacked for having pro Oklahoma, voting histories and those outside money groups, right? Some national
Yes.
money coming in and knocking them out.
Yes. And there was even some controversy about OCPA attacking candidates to the point where Representative Moore and his wife filed a restraining order against employees of that organization. And so there was some contentiousness in this House and Senate races in particular. So there will be some lawmakers who will be going to the runoff. Another notable House race that I'll lift is House District 44, which Representative Virgin will be terming out of. And that was Deck was the winner of that race. So he likely will be the person who succeeds Representative Virgin in that district.
So. Yeah, we didn't talk a lot about some of the Democratic races, and aside from the beginning saying this could be one of the reasons the Democratic turnout was so low is that people didn't have as much to vote for. I mean, certainly there's not even a Democrat running in every district as there are Republicans, and so there's less incentive for some folks to go vote. However, every Democrat and independent voter could vote in some of those top of the ticket statewide races like senator, including the race for the Democratic nominee for Inhofe seat. That is also going to a runoff. There were 6 candidates, and Madison Horn came in with the highest of 37%. Second place is Jason Bollinger. So they will head to a runoff in August. And then the winner of that will face the winner of Markwayne Mullen or T.W. Shannon. And then everybody else, I think, was by and large expected, right? Senator Young, George Young, retained his seat.
By a significant margin.
Yeah. Representative Mari Turner retained their seat. The ones Vicky Bahina won the race for DA for Oklahoma County. That was
and on the Republican side, Kevin Calvi he was very, very close to getting 50% plus one of the vote to secure the Republican nomination. He was 49.97 or something like that. And so he'll go to a runoff for the Republican nomination.
Yeah, that'll be interesting. And from what I understand, Calvi and his runoff opponent, Geiger is the last name. I forget the first name, but I guess they don't like each other. Like it's a pretty, it's personal already. So it'll be interesting to see how this plays out between now and August. Calvi's got a ton of money and probably energy behind him, but I think there's a growing anti-Calvi sentiment in that part of the county. So we'll see.
And on the Democratic side, to succeed him for Commissioner 1, Kathy Cummings won the Democratic seat.
That's right.
And I'll have to look up who the Republican that secured the seat, because he did achieve the 50% plus one. So we know who will be running in November in those 2 races.
Yeah, Miles Davidson.
Miles Davidson, that's what
deputy.
it is. Yeah.
Now he's been a deputy commissioner for a long time.
Yes.
So anyway, the what was once foggy outlook for November is starting to clear some. So we're starting to see what this might look like and where these lines will shape up. I hope that there's more energy by the time we get to November. I had a call today with a colleague here who was running some of these campaigns, and he's like, it just feels like everyone is like beat down, right? On the heels of the Supreme Court rulings, really low turnout, just everyone feels tired. And so our call was supposed to be more strategic and kind of giving updates, but it ended up being a bit of a, a bit of a therapeutic session, I think, for both of us to talk through, like, well, how are we feeling, right? If we do this for a living and we work in this area, how do we feel? And then try to extrapolate, well, how does just a regular rank and file person feel out there, right? Like, my mom was my longtime canary in the coal mine, right? I would check with her and see how she was feeling, because she seemed to often, her sentiment was in line with public sentiment. And so I need to check in with my dad and my sister, and maybe a few other folks that are aware of this stuff but don't, you know, aren't spending all day texting with each other about it, right? That
Right.
see the But I think, all the commercials, heck, even Mayor Holt like tweeted about how bad the commercials have been this cycle, and how, overwhelming and depressing. And so we're
Well, and I think over time, um, we'll continue to sadly see that trend. I think 2016 changed the
yeah,
landscape of political communication.
yep,
We have a rise of what people call like political outsiders, like they, aren't career politicians, and they're reshaping what it means to work in these spaces, the rhetoric that's being used, right? The way that government functions. Like there's been some shifts in a lot of these different areas since 2016. And I do wonder how much of that is also causing the burnout of people, and even the sentiment. There are a lot of people that I've heard from who say, why bother?
yeah,
Oklahoma's just a red state. Why bother? Even though we've had a Oklahoma has only been ran by Republicans like in the past like 15 years. So it like
mhm,
in Oklahoma's 100-year history, like this is still fairly new, but it feels like forever for a lot of people. And I mean, maybe when you look at ideology, there's always been populism and conservativeness mixed up, over time. But I mean, the Republican leadership now is still, fairly fresh, but also like the idea of this of the different changes that have been happening have made people feel like, oh, why bother? Even though we've had like Medicaid expansion, right? We just hit the 1 year anniversary of Oklahoma expanding Medicaid, right? 300,000 Oklahomans have health coverage that they wouldn't have had before,
mhm,
right? We were able to pass medical marijuana, right, for the state. We were able to pass, some significant criminal justice reforms that would decriminalize um, certain offenses, right? Like there have been some significant things done in the state, yet there's still that sentiment of my voice doesn't matter. Things are going to be the way that they are. And so that is going to be a long-term nut to crack, right? Of
yeah,
how do you re-inspire people to feel like there's hope, that there's a chance that the pendulum can swing, and not even just like, I'm not talking about swing for Democrats to control, but bringing that balance back, right? To where there isn't a super majority to the point of where one party has complete control and doesn't even have to talk to the other side, right?
right,
Like how do you bring back that pendulum of balance to where that reduces that rhetoric, I would think, because then people would have to work together to get things done. And so that is true, Andy, that there is this sentiment that exists, even though a lot of this is recent and we've made some significant progress, right?
yeah,
As a quote unquote red state.
yeah. That's exactly right. And I think in terms of raw numbers, right? Like, the change is a lot closer than people think in Oklahoma, where it's not like California, it's not like, Seattle, it's not like New York, it's not even like Georgia or Alabama. Like, the ability, the chance of us making change is not, hundreds of thousands of voters. We can make notable, significant change by registering and turning out 10,000, 20,000 voters, which is a lot of people. But if we get together and like knock doors or make phone calls and do the work that we've seen in other states, we can do it, right? I mean, a team of 10 people 10 volunteers making calls for a couple hours a night can usually call through 30 to 50 calls a night, right? So that's, or excuse me, like 100 calls. So you can get, thousands of phone calls made. Like I have a colleague that's doing this. They're 6,000 calls a week, right? Ding, 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 ding. Imagine, right? If we do this week after week, month after month, year after year, like, we're going to get there. Now, the other side is doing some work too.
And Andy, to that point, even looking at it as a longing, right? And
Yeah.
not like the end being this one election or this one race, right? The more work we do over time and the continuous work helps us to move the direction that we want to see as a country or as a state, frankly, right? And I think that's part of it, is like not looking at a single outcome as the end all, right?
Yeah.
Like the end all is not the reversal of Roe v. Wade. And the end all is not, um, who is appointed on the Supreme Court, because there's opportunities to change those things over time if we put in the work, as you're mentioning.
Yeah. Well, and I just think to me, the end all is representation and policy that reflects the values of Oklahomans, right? And of each district, of the state as a whole. And I don't think that's the case right now. And we see that in the polling, we see that in the responses to actions from elected officials now. And as you said, I think the decrease in turnout is one of the indicators, right? That politicians in our state, in many cases, are out of step with where Oklahomans want it to be. And we have two options, right? We can tune out or we can tune in. And listeners, as I do every week, I am pleading with you to tune in, right? Take this weekend, take the next couple of weeks, regroup, rest, whatever. You can tune out for a little bit. I mean, I got to do that. Like, I haven't listened to NPR or really any news in a couple of weeks. I've cut way back on my Twitter consumption because it was bad for my mental health, right? I'm trying to go outside more, go to the, city pool, see friends, mow the yard, garden, whatever it is, spend time with my family, woodworking, whatever it is that fills your cup, do it. But then come back, man, because from July through November, we need to hit it and hit it hard, and we will see results. And those results on their own will be motivating, and we can do it, right? We can't wait
I
for
love
someone to
that,
help us.
Andy.
It is us. We are the people we are waiting for. We can do it.
Yes,
Right.
100%.
On that note, let's end on a more positive note. Tell us about what's happening in Congress with food security.
Yes, so this is a rare time where Congress took action on something during a campaign season. So typically things are a lot slower on Capitol Hill right after, I'd say, March, April, as many candidates on the right and the left. So this is not even a partisan. This is just Congress, right? That people are going back to their home districts to campaign, to prepare for not only the primaries that have just happened, but preparing for the general elections. And so not a lot of significant policy changes typically happen during this time. So during the pandemic, one of the key things that the federal government did to help us feed children was providing flexibilities on the child nutrition programs that existed. So we had programs that would feed kids in the summer. We have programs that feed kids during the school year, and they have strict requirements of how you have to operate, right? The types of food that you have to feed to kids, the settings that the kids are in, the curriculum that you're providing for enrichment, right? You have to do all of these things in order to be reimbursed for those meals, right? And so during a global pandemic, you can't bring kids into a congregate meal setting safely, right, to feed them. And one of the requirements was that kids had to be in like a congregate meal setting, and they had to eat their food right there. So if they were to leave, if they ate like their chicken nuggets and their mashed potatoes, but they want to take their apple with them, they wouldn't be able to under the way that the rules are currently set up. But the federal government waived a lot of things to allow states to have more flexibility in feeding kids, right? From the mealtime waivers to allowing area eligibility, to ensuring that that kid doesn't have to sit there to eat the food in order to receive that meal, right? Their parent or guardian can come get the meals to feed the kids, and we were able to feed a lot more children across this country because of those flexibilities put in place. Well, they were set to expire June 30th, and that caused a lot of confusion of what the meal providers, like in the school settings and in the after school settings and all those places, of what they would be able to do. Because there were so many that said, if I have to go back to those old rules and the way that we did things, then I won't be able to do it. I won't be able to meet the needs to be able to feed those kids. And so we were at risk of losing a lot of meal providers if we didn't allow those flexibilities to continue on. Well, Congress took up legislation called the Keep Kids Fed Act of 2022 and was led by the ranking member and the chairman of the Labor and Ed Committee of the House, because that's the committee that child nutrition legislation goes under, and the Agriculture Committee, the chairman and the ranking member of the Senate, because that's where that legislation goes through on the Senate side. So with those four leaders on one accord and pushing that through, gave it the push that it needed to extend some of those flexibilities that were put in place to feed children. And so a few of the things that the bill did was it extended the nationwide flexibilities to summer meals through September. It provided schools with additional temporary reimbursements. It provided family daycare homes with higher temporary reimbursement rates. And it equipped USDA with additional flexibilities to support more schools. And so a lot of the waivers were extended through June 30th of 2023. So that gives more meal providers the support and relief they need to continue meeting the need, because we know that the pandemic is not over, and that need continues to remain to make sure that kids are fed. And so this was a huge step of Congress stepping in at the ninth hour, but they stepped in and they made it happen. And so we're grateful for even our congressional delegation of making sure that made it over to the finish line.
All right. That is good news. Kids having enough food is always good news, as far as I'm concerned. All right. Well, I think that brings us to the end of the episode. Bailey, thank you for being here today.
Andy, thank you. Appreciate it.
Listeners, thank you for being here today. I will also acknowledge that today, this is Friday, July 1st, is the 51st anniversary of the signing of the 26th Amendment, which granted everyone over the age of 18 the right to vote. As they said at Common Cause, we cannot take the right to vote for granted, because as we learned in the last week, there are forces in this world interested in taking away our rights, and we can't have that. Ain't nobody got time for that. All right, listeners, enjoy your weekend. Happy birthday, America. Looking forward to some parades, some pool time, and perhaps some kind of explosive devices, and friendly confetti-filled or light-filled explosive devices. And hope to see many of you out there lining the streets at some of our fun parades. In the meantime, get some rest, have a good week, and find new ways to show up next week, because as we know, decisions are made by those who show up.